Chapter 15. Jungle World. The cutter was still slightly off level, but now motionless and silent. Sunlight still shone through the seams, and the last of the water drained quickly. Daniel pulled his earring off the wall and returned it to his ear. He cautiously stepped over to the lower end of the cutter and scooped wet sand up to the center of the floor to keep the generator in place. Without Vogel seeing, he tapped the clock's snooze button. Vogel stood from his half-crouch in the corner and cautiously approached the hatch on the opposite wall. He slid the lever to the side. The hatch swung inward from its weight. He stumbled but recovered as painfully bright sunlight and a rush of hot, humid air flowed in. Vogel hissed in frustration. Daniel and Fate could see why from their positions in the rear of the cutter. They weren't home yet. The view was obstructed by a tangle of greens and browns. They were high up in the canopy of a vast jungle. The ground over 60 feet below was obscured by dozens of intervening branches of all sizes. Their arrival had silenced the monkeys, birds, and frogs. Even the insects had fallen silent, but only temporarily. The hushed audience resumed at once, as if cued by an unseen conductor. Daniel began taking notes while Fate and Vogel argued about what to do next. It's obvious that just turning it on again isn't going to get us home, Shadrach. We need to stop and think. As long as I have this, Vogel brought out the pistol again, I'll make the decisions, and I say we go again. We don't know where that might be. We could end up underwater again or buried deeper than the desert or worse. What if next time we're this high in the air and there's no tree to stop us from falling to our deaths? Think, Shadrach, Fate pleaded. Daniel finished his notes and addressed them. We need food and water before we try again. This world is a jungle, so it should have both. You two should go and find some. I can wait here and guard the cutter. Vogel chuckled, which sounded more like a growl. Nice try, boy, but I'm not going out there. You are. Now get over here and climb down. Daniel didn't move. Vogel lost his patience and stomped over. He lifted Daniel by his shirt and pushed him toward the hatch. It's a jungle, Shadrach. You can't send a child out there alone. He's not going alone, Vogel said, and smiled, showing yellow teeth. He pointed the pistol at Fate and waved him over. Daniel allowed himself a satisfied grin as he climbed out of the hatch. What are we supposed to use as a canteen, Shadrach? Our hands? Figure it out, and don't come back empty-handed. If I have to go out there, the first thing I'm going to do is shoot the both of you. Now get going. Daniel was already out of the cutter. He stood on a branch as thick as his waist and steadied himself with a smaller limb above his head. This world was warmer than the previous one. It had so much pollen in the air that it stung Daniel's sinuses, forcing him to breathe through his mouth. He began climbing down with the nimble grace only children possess. Halfway down, he noticed a strange black lump, the size of a bowling ball, embedded in the tree's trunk. Beneath a thin layer of clear yellow solidified sap, it looked to Daniel like a meteor that had been charred by its journey through the atmosphere. He also noticed, as he passed it, that it was strongly magnetic. It pushed at Daniel's earring and pulled at his backpack. One of the steel buckles struck it with a clink. It took a hard pull to get free of it, and Daniel almost stumbled on the smooth branches. Thankful to be away from Vogel, he was in no mood to examine the meteorite closer and kept climbing down. By the time Fate joined him at the forest floor, Daniel had pulled a rolled-up orange T-shirt from his backpack. He had lately started wearing only orange T-shirts as an experiment in efficiency. The spare in his backpack was for art class, and it was the only shirt he owned, which had a blemish. A small red dab of paint adorned the back, the result of a mishap which Daniel suspected was not entirely accidental. He began tearing the spare shirt into narrow strips. You have a change of clothes in there? Fate exclaimed in disbelief. "For art class," replied Daniel flatly. "You wouldn't happen to have anything helpful in there, would you?" said Fate hopefully. "Books and pencils," said Daniel, wishing for something more useful like a weapon. "All right then. Here's the plan," Fate began, but Daniel turned and started down the narrow pathway. Fate followed him and continued, "We find a village and get them to take us to civilization and call for help." Daniel tied a strip of his orange shirt to a tree as high up as he could reach. "This actually feels like a relief," said Fate optimistically. "I mean, sure, we're lost in the jungle, but we got away from Shadrach without getting killed, and that's something. Now all we have to do is find some people. I'm good with people, you know." He began whistling "Tie a Yellow Ribbon" as Daniel fastened another marker. Before they continued, Daniel whispered back to Fate, "Jungles have predators." Fate stopped whistling and looked around at the trees warily. "And this isn't our universe," added Daniel. "You don't," Fate began and lowered his voice to a whisper. "You don't know that." "Still no contrails in the sky," Daniel said and pointed upward. From their position on the ground, not a bit of blue sky pierced the thick canopy overhead, but Daniel had checked for signs of their world before he climbed down the tree. The winding trail was so narrow that only a few inches separated the dense undergrowth on either side. Sharp, broken branches and thorns threatened them at each step. It was difficult to tell whether they were going uphill or downhill in the long run, since the trail seemed to be alternating between the two after every few steps, and they couldn't see more than a few yards ahead or behind. They crested a hill, and the narrow animal trail joined a much wider path at a sharp angle. Daniel dropped down and brushed away the dirt and debris with his hands. Underneath was the unmistakable smoothness of well-worn cobblestones. "Is that a road?" shouted Fate gleefully. "An ancient road," Daniel confirmed. Fate laughed. "But it's a road. It has to go somewhere." They studied the two options. Both directions were more straight than the path they had been on, but both also had several fallen trees blocking the way. This road had not been used for a very long time. "Well, left or right, Daniel Boone?" said Fate cheerfully. Daniel scowled at him. "Oh, wait, what am I thinking?" he said, and made 2 turns in place, untwisting his lines. Then he fished the tethered coins out of his pocket, tossed them into the air, and caught one. "We go left." Fate quickly retwisted with a turn to the right and proceeded down the path. Daniel frowned but followed reluctantly. "Why?" "I forgot you're new to this. It's randomness." He searched Daniel's face for any sign of understanding. "You know, luck." "There's no such thing as luck," said Daniel confidently. "It's just a trick of the brain and confirmation bias." "Ah, that's where you're wrong." "Well, I mean, you're right. For other ordinary people. For them, luck is just that." "What did you call it? Confirmation bias? When their lucky shirt makes them win, they remember forever. But when they lose, it's quickly forgotten. Ordinary people experience this fake change in randomness, but not us. For us, it's real, at least when our lines are untangled. That's why I use a coin toss to decide where I should go. I used to do it with just 1 coin for left and right, but that was too cumbersome. There was no stop or go straight. So I had to flip it twice. A very talented man working in a stationery store in Connecticut made this for me from 2 coins. Isn't it nice? He offered the coins to Daniel. Daniel accepted them and gasped. He stared at the coins, turning them over slowly with reverence. Oh my. These are... Daniel hadn't stuttered like this since he was 5, but the sight of the precious coins shocked him to his core. He had to close his eyes and began again. These are 1804 draped bust dollars. They were never circulated. They're worth, he forced himself to take a breath. They're worth $3 million each, and you have 2 of them, and you're tossing them in the air, and you've painted them with... Is this fingernail polish? Toenail polish, said Fate whimsically. He tipped his head slightly to the side. If there's a difference, yes, they're quite nice. I particularly like the lady's bosom on the front side. Obverse, Daniel muttered reflexively and handed them back gently. They were so precious to him that even holding them seemed wrong. Why did you deface them with paint? Daniel said before he could stop himself. I'm sorry, but why? Why would you do that to priceless coins? I wouldn't say defaced, said Fate defensively. I had a bartender friend of mine do it. He winked at Daniel. She was painting her toenails at the time. The idea of a drunk bartender splashing red paint on these rare treasures was too much for Daniel. He stood in stunned silence. Fate noticed his displeasure and explained, Until a second ago, I didn't know they were the collector's pieces you seem to think they are, Daniel. Anyway, I thought the calligraphy was quite good work, especially when you consider the materials she had to work with. They certainly didn't cost $3 million. That would have been obscene. $6 million, Daniel corrected reflexively. He wondered if Fate had some wild story about how he bought them from a man in a pub for $1 each. Where did you get them? I found them, said Fate proudly. Lucky thing, that. I was in China at the time. Now there's a story. American coins. In China. I suppose that's nothing today, but back then, well, that was quite something. 6 million. Are you sure about that? Perhaps I should sell them and buy a dune buggy or a Jeep with removable doors. I quite like that. I'm pretty sure you don't need $6 million to buy a Jeep, said Daniel sarcastically. I have been known to overpay a bit from time to time, but that might be too much even for me. Now, if it came already washed... Daniel laughed. Even a washed Jeep isn't worth $6 million. It felt good to laugh. It seemed like an eternity since Daniel had anything worth laughing about. Are you sure? These things change quite a lot. I have trouble keeping up with them. Anyway, these coins always point me where I need to go. Well, wait, that's not quite true. Obviously, this time they brought me back to a madman. He thrust his thumb over his shoulder. But at the end of this journey must be something amazing. Daniel realized that he should have been taking notes and pulled the notebook from his pocket. How did you know that heads means right and tails means left? This question seemed to throw Fate for a moment. You know, I've never thought about it before. I just always assumed right was heads. Maybe that's part of it. Who knows, he said, and began walking backward so he could wink at Daniel. After a few steps, he turned back around to see where he was going. Daniel followed after finishing his notes and tying another orange trail marker on a branch. I noticed you retwisted your lines, said Daniel curiously. Why? Why not just stay untwisted all the time? Well, as I said, it has negative side effects on the people around you. And then there are the squirrels. He scanned the trees warily. Squirrels! Exclaimed Daniel with excitement at the prospect of solving a puzzle that had been haunting him for 2 days. I saw some of them do something strange the other day. Were you untwisted? Maybe. I think it may have been the first time, said Daniel eagerly. That's it. Fascinating creatures, squirrels, equal parts clever thief and daft clown. They sense it from farther away than anything or anyone else. It sends them into a frenzy, and they'll steal anything they can get their claws on. Zippered pockets. Now there's a pearl for you, Daniel. Zippered pockets. I'll make a note, Daniel said with excitement and scribbled in his notebook. When he had finished, he looked up again as something occurred to him. Fate was absent-mindedly tossing the pair of coins in the air and catching one or the other. Why didn't you just use an arrow? Asked Daniel. Sorry, what? Muttered Fate. The coins, said Daniel. You said there was no way to use just one because there were only 2 sides, one for left and one for right. But you could have just put an arrow on one side and stop on the other. Then just go whichever way the arrow pointed when it landed. That would cover left, right, and straight. One coin. Simpler. Fate paused and turned to face Daniel, clearly stunned. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, gathered his thoughts, and simply said, "My way is better. I like having two." He resumed walking. Daniel hurried to keep up, very pleased with himself. "You didn't think of it, did you?" Fate sighed. No, Daniel, I didn't think of it. I suppose everything will get simpler for me now that I've got a traveling companion." He smiled, and Daniel felt a warmth come over him. He liked the idea of traveling and exploring this new world with Fate, as long as they could keep away from Vogel. After 10 minutes of walking and climbing over fallen trees, they arrived at a much taller obstacle. This tree was blocking the road, but it was so large they couldn't see over it. It had been there so long that the traffic of other animals had worn away some of the rotten wood. They cautiously climbed over the soft, wet muck that used to be a 1,000-year-old tree. As Fate cleared the top of it, he nearly fell down the other side at the sight of a huge stone building in the center of a grassy meadow. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Daniel was too busy sketching in his notebook to answer. The structure was a pyramid over 400 feet wide at the base, 200 feet tall, and covered with vines. The once white limestone of its smooth surface was now gray with age and filth. The sudden openness of the meadow was a stark contrast to the dense jungle. They left its cover cautiously. As they drew closer, the pyramid's features became more distinct, and they could see that the lower 30 feet of the front face had relief carvings depicting people in various poses. There was a shirtless, barefoot man in a wraparound skirt staring up and pointing at the sky. Another was a child on his hands and knees staring down. They all had one thing in common. They were all posing with a book. The child in the image wasn't staring at the ground, as Daniel first thought. There was a book on the floor, and he was reading it. The man pointing at the sky had an open volume in his other hand. In another alcove stood a man and a woman side by side, reading the same book. The only door to the interior of the pyramid was in the center of the front face. It was slightly higher than ground level. Wide stone steps joined the meadow's short green grass to the pyramid's doorway. Daniel led the way cautiously. Before they reached the first step, Fate heard a clicking sound behind them and turned around to see what it was. A monkey was standing only a few feet behind him. He froze. It wasn't moving and made no more sounds. At nearly 3 feet tall, it was large for a monkey and had a long snout flanked by parallel wrinkles along each side like a baboon. Its large eyes radiated kindness and resembled those of a lemur. White and brown striped fur covered the usual complement of primate appendages: 2 arms, 2 legs, and a short tail. Apart from the fact that it was standing upright, the only strange thing about it was the belt around its waist, attached to a small leather pouch. Fate smiled, and it mimicked him, displaying a double row of sharp teeth. Fate stopped smiling. The monkey did as well, but retained the slightest upturn at the corners of his mouth. He was grinning. "Daniel?" Fate called, without turning away from the visitor. Daniel turned. When he saw the monkey, he hurried back down the steps. Fate noticed what it was holding in its grip. The monkey thrust its hand forward. It was a fistful of their orange trail markers, held out like a bouquet of wilted flowers. Fate cautiously accepted the gift. "Yes, thanks awfully." Daniel furiously scribbled in his notebook and whispered, "It's intelligent." "Let's not jump to conclusions," Fate whispered back. He untied a few ribbons. Daniel stopped and looked up at Fate seriously. "That means we're lost now." I can find our way, reassured Fate. We've gone 273 paces. The cutter's that way. He pointed in the direction they came. The monkey mimicked him and pointed. You were counting your steps? Asked Daniel, impressed. You weren't? I always do. It's not a conscious thing, really, said Fate. Daniel closed his notebook. Collecting the ribbons wasn't the sign of intelligence. He gave us a gift. That's the sign of intelligence. He reached into his pocket and drew out a red Swiss Army knife. Daniel offered it to their new friend, who cautiously accepted it. The strange creature examined the knife with excitement, first sniffing, then tentatively biting it. Yes, intelligent, said Fate sarcastically. I'm sure he can tell us how to get home. The monkey demonstrated great dexterity in unfolding each of the knife's accessories. It's some kind of baboon. I once saw a troop of them in Africa, said Fate curiously. He peered around at the visitor's short tail. They had much longer tails, and of course they didn't walk on two legs like this. Not a baboon, Daniel corrected. A mandrill, Mandrillus sphinx, which has apparently evolved to stand upright. It's fascinating. So, Standrill? Offered Fate with a chuckle. Daniel shot him a disapproving look. Mandrillus erectus would be more appropriate. Yes, but it doesn't really roll off the tongue, now does it? Howls and hoops from the trees stole their attention away. Soon the forest exploded with dozens of spear-wielding adults from their new friend's clan. They slowed their pace at the edge of the meadow, cautiously assessing the situation. The crowd stopped advancing and parted to allow the largest male to pass. He had brilliant blue skin on his face, fringed with red. The colors were impossibly bright and looked as though they might even glow in the dark. The others had some of the same colorations, but none was as pronounced as the leader's. He advanced slowly. His eyes met those of the child. Without a sound, the big male pointed a finger at the forest behind him. Their young friend made a chirping sound at Daniel and Fate before running to rejoin his troop. As soon as he was safely behind the leader, the entire group howled. Daniel, whispered Fate nervously, I'd rather not drop to the ground just now. How difficult would it be for you to untwist? One turn counterclockwise, replied Daniel with growing unease. I think it would be a good idea to do that right now, don't you? The alpha male lifted his spear above his head and howled above the din of the others, signaling a charge. As the monkeys advanced, Daniel crouched and spun quickly. The grass at their feet danced its synchronized dance like a stone dropped in a puddle. As soon as the charging mandrills reached the influence of Daniel's untwisted lines, they stopped and exchanged puzzled glances. They moved in a circle surrounding Daniel and Fate. The flint-tipped spears that had been pointed at them were now held vertically. The leader stopped in front of Daniel and exhaled loudly like an angry bull. He took his spear in both hands and presented it. Fate reached out to accept it, but the male opened his mouth wide and screeched at him with such vigor that Fate had to wipe the spittle from his eyes. All right then, said Fate nervously. Perhaps you should take it, Daniel. Daniel accepted the spear and bowed slightly. The male whistled a signal to the others. They rushed forward, dropping gifts of salted meat, berries, and an animal's skin filled with water. Fate began to reach for the water, but stopped and eyed the mandrills warily. Daniel, could you please pass me the whatever it is there that appears to contain water? Before Daniel could comply, a thunderous bang came from deep in the forest. Fate ducked reflexively. The spell on the mandrills momentarily broke, and they ran to the safety of the trees. Fate stood up straight. What the hell was that? 30 minutes, said Daniel, looking at his watch. Fate wrinkled his brow in confusion. What does that mean? I set the snooze alarm for 30 minutes before we left. I think that was the sound of the generator sending something to universe number 5. Fate chuckled nervously. Something? Daniel shrugged and began going through their gifts. There are several possibilities, but too many variables to say for sure. If he tried to turn it off and got too close, it may have arced through him. It may have sent just him. Or it may have sent the cutter as well. Or it may have just repeated his original solo trip. And landed him outside the cutter, whispered Fate seriously. 60 feet above the ground, said Daniel, pleased with himself. It is unlikely he could have survived that possibility. We should investigate, but I want to look inside the library first. Library? It's a pyramid, said Fate, still trying to process whether Vogel was dead or just gone, and whether the cutter was also gone, leaving them stranded. It's full of books, Daniel called over his shoulder. He was already at the top of the steps. Fate hurried to join him. An ancient wooden door had fallen off its hinges. It was lying on the floor just inside the structure. We need to fix this, said Daniel, trying to lift one edge of the heavy door. Why? Asked Fate. Daniel grunted at the weight of it and nodded toward the open doorway. That. Fate turned to see what Daniel was pointing at. 500 feet away, where the trees of the jungle met the meadow, was an enormous bear. It had dark brown fur and an oddly short nose, but its most remarkable feature was its immense size. It was larger than an elephant, larger than a rhino, larger than 2 rhinos tail to horn, and it had a predator's teeth, predator's claws, and a predator's cunning. It was large enough to make an easy meal of anything smaller than a moose. They backed slowly away from the open doorway toward the staircase to the second floor. The years had not been any kinder to the wooden staircase than they had to the door. Daniel avoided the centers of the steps, knowing that was the weakest point. He cautiously traversed them, taking 2 at a time slowly to reduce the possibility of stepping on a rotten one. Fate used no caution. He tried to run straight up the middle, but only made it to the 3rd step before it gave way under his weight. Daniel reached the 2nd floor and turned back as Fate pulled himself out of the tight hole he had created. Fate crawled the rest of the way up on hands and knees as the bear reached the doorway. Its head was far too large to fit through the opening. It paused to growl and snort several times before withdrawing its snout in favor of a huge paw, which it used to pull out various pieces of furniture and rubble, including the crumbled remnants of the door. Having no luck at fishing out anything edible, it decided to circle the building in search of another way inside. With the immediate danger gone, Daniel and Fate took the time to examine their surroundings. The building's interior was exactly like any library from their world. There were desks and chairs, but most of the space was taken up by row after row of bookshelves. It had a musty smell that reminded Daniel of an old attic, full of discarded clothes, old toys, and trunks full of mysteries.